Good morning. So, this is the time of year where we take some time. This is the beginning of our church year. Actually, the next month will be September. And this is the time of year where we look back at where we've been the year before and where we look ahead to where we're going to be going in the next year. So last year, if you remember, if you were here, our focus for this last year was pray, say, and serve. That's what we were to be focused on this last year, and we did that. So we were to be people of prayer who speak the gospel in words, but also with our service. Now this year, you may have figured out, our focus for this year will be taking courage. Now that doesn't mean that we're going to forget, just wipe away all the pray, say, and serve. What that means is that in this environment that we now find ourselves, growing hostility towards Christians, we are going to need to take courage in order to pray, say, and serve well in our community. So this has been a year of ups and downs for all of us. You know, I look around the room, I see people who have dealt with death of family members. I see people who have dealt with sickness. I know for me and my family, we have now been at this church for almost a year. The first time I came and stood here and taught was on September 8th of last year, and we were teaching through the book of Corinthians. I got to teach 1 Corinthians 8. So John and Holly Powell were here, their family. He was the pastor of this church, and they got called away, and the church body here found themselves without a pastor. And I know when I came here, things were a little rocky, things were a little bumpy, people didn't know what was going to happen, and but by the beginning of this year, things were going great. We had a real forward momentum. We had a good momentum going, right? Our attendance numbers were up every week. We were up. Children's church was growing and thriving. We had a membership connections class that was the biggest ever. Things were going really, really well. And it wasn't just here. Our North Campus as well was doing good, right? In January of this year at North Campus, there were 200 people per week more on average than the previous January. College ministry had started up. They hired a new pastor up there, Michael Winstead, to run the college group. It was doing great. It was growing by leaps and bounds. Things were looking great. And then what happened? COVID hit. And all of a sudden, everything came to a screeching halt, including our forward momentum. It all came to a screeching halt. And we were forced to adapt very quickly. And thankfully, we have a bunch of talented men and women who were able to take our ministry almost immediately online, so we didn't miss a beat. But things were tough for everybody, right? As we just look back at this year, the beginning of this year has been tough for everybody, right? People have gotten sick. Friends and family members may have died from this virus, right? There's a lot of fear of the unknown, not really knowing what to expect from day to day. Even now, we still don't know what to expect. Lots of people, including myself, our company shut down. We lost our jobs. We were laid off. We were told to quarantine. We were told to wear masks. Church was shut down. We could no longer meet in person. And you add to that what we've seen over the last few months, the growing hostility towards Christ and his followers. And that seems to be increasing as our society, as our culture seems to grow more and more secular. So what is the Christian to do when all that you thought and hoped and worked for and thought would happen when it all goes wrong? What does the Christian do when you're facing increasing hostility? When you find yourself between a rock and a hard place, what is a Christian to do? I think the first thing that we need to do is we need to remember that for Christians, this is not abnormal. This is not the first time in history that Christians have found themselves between a rock and a hard place, between disappointment and hostility. All we have to do is go back to the first century. Now, I want you to go back to the first century, the times of Jesus. Jesus was on this earth. He walked with his disciples. His disciples loved this man. They spent time with him. They ate with him. They walked with him. They watched him heal. They talked with him. They laughed with him. Where he laid his head, they laid their heads. And then all of a sudden one day, he's crucified and he's gone. You talk about disappointment. You talk about sadness. And then not only that, the men who crucified Jesus are now hunting them. So you talk about disappointment and hostility, both coming at these people. And there was a very real threat that they would die themselves. And so what did they do? They're disappointed. They're facing hostility. What did they do? They took courage. They took courage. Now, what did they take courage in? They didn't take courage in themselves. They didn't take courage in their situation. They took courage in the fact that Jesus, their Savior, their friend, had risen from the dead. He had conquered death. And not only that, he had appeared to them and he had told them, I will be with you until the end of the age. I will be with you until the end of the age. And in our passage today, we're going to look at the life of Apostle Paul, who finds himself right in the middle of this situation in the first century. Growing hostility towards Christians. And this is exactly where Paul finds himself. And we're going to see that he finds himself disappointed and facing hostility, and we're going to see how he reacted to that. So we're going to be in Acts 23. If you have your Bibles open to Acts 23. Just by way of a little bit of background, I want to kind of get a running start at the passage, kind of to build some background about where we're at, where Paul is at. So this is what's going on with Paul. Anybody who has read the New Testament, anybody who has read Paul's letters knows that Paul had a deep, deep love and a deep compassion and a deep desire for the Jewish people to be saved. He loved these people with all of his heart. He was a Jewish man himself. And so one of the deepest desires of his heart was for them to be saved. He even said at some point that he would rather go to hell than be saved if it meant these men could be saved. That's how much he loved these men, these Jewish people. Listen to what he says in Romans. This is Paul speaking about this issue. He says, I am speaking the truth in Christ. I am not lying. My conscience bears me witness in the Holy Spirit that I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. For I could wish that I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, my kinsmen, according to the flesh. Paul said he would go to hell for his brothers if they could be saved. That is supernatural love. That is the love of Christ in Paul. He had a desire for them to be saved. Later on in Romans, he says this, brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Jews is that they may be saved. So Paul gets saved. He has this desire for the Jewish people to get saved. So he plans to go to Jerusalem. The Lord tells him, Paul, I don't want you to go to Jerusalem. They're not going to listen to you. They will not pay attention to you. So Paul obeys. God sends him out to the Gentiles. He spends many years with the Gentiles ministering to them, starting churches, but still in the deep parts of his heart, he still has a desire to go back to Israel, to go back to Jerusalem for these men to be saved. So he makes plans to go back. And against all advice from all his friends are telling him, the Spirit told me don't go back. There's going to be trouble if you go back. Paul said, I don't care. I don't care. I will face trouble if it means my Jewish brothers can be saved. So he finally goes back. He's in Jerusalem. And what's the first thing that happens? The Jews lie about him because they know he's been with Gentiles. They don't like the Gentiles. The Gentiles are defiled and polluted and cannot be saved. So they start a rumor. Paul is bringing Gentiles into the temple. So now the Jewish people are freaking out. They attack Paul. They're beating him. They're trying to tear him apart. These are the people that he loves, that he went to go save. The Romans see this. The Roman soldiers see this. They rush in. They grab Paul. They get him out of the grip of the Jewish people. They try to calm everything down. They're holding Paul. They're protecting him. They're trying to get answers to what's going on. This guy's saying one thing. This guy's saying another. There's mass confusion. So they lift Paul up. They carry him up the stairs of the fortress to get him away from the crowd, to protect him. As they're going up the stairs, Paul says to the guards, can I speak to the people? Can I say something to the people, please? The guard says, okay. So they set him down on the steps. Paul turns around. He faces this crowd of Jewish people that he loves. This is his big moment. This is what his life has been about. He can't wait to share the gospel with these people. And he starts to speak. And he begins to share his testimony. The crowd quiets. They're all listening to him share his testimony. Everything's going great. And then Paul says one wrong thing. God sent me to the Gentiles, and the people lose it because the Gentiles are filthy, defiled. They don't want to hear that God is blessing the Gentiles, and so a riot threatens to break out again. Paul's day has gone from bad to worse, right? So the guards pick him up, they take him into custody, and the very next day they bring him to find out what's going on. They bring him before the Jewish, what we would call the Jewish Supreme Court, which was called the Sanhedrin. That is where we find ourselves. That's where we enter our story right here in chapter 22, verse 30. We'll start there. That's what's going on. 22, verse 30 says this, but on the next day, Desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him, that's the guard, unbound him, and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet, and he brought Paul down and set him before them. Looking intently at the council, Paul said, "Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day." And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall." Right? He loses his temper with the high priest. I mean, who can blame him? "Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law you ordered me to be struck?" Those who stood by, they were shocked. They said, "Would you revile God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." Now, whether or not Paul knew this was a high priest, we don't know. Whether or not that was a sarcastic comment like, "Hey, he's not acting like the high priest. How was I to know?" We don't know. Maybe Paul didn't recognize him. He wasn't wearing his outfit. We don't know, his uniform. So, verse 6. Now, when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council. So just a quick bit of background. The Pharisees and the Sadducees were two groups of Jewish people, right, that sprang up between the New Testament and the Old Testament. And they disagreed. They both believed in God, but the Pharisees believed in the resurrection, and they believed in spirits and angels. The Sadducees did not believe in that. They didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in spirits. Paul, knowing this, this is what he does. And Paul himself was a Pharisee. This is what he does. He says, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial." And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply. "We find nothing wrong in this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him?" And when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and to bring him into the barracks. So, Paul's day has gone from bad to worse. Another near riot breaks out, right? They're ready to kill him. All his hopes and dreams and desires for these people to be saved have been extinguished. He's facing hostility. These people that he loves so much are about to kill him. And he goes into a prison cell. He goes into custody that night. And I can just imagine Paul sitting in that prison cell. I can imagine him beginning to doubt himself and question himself, thinking, "Man, what happened? Did I say something wrong? Should I have brought up the Gentiles? Man, I can't believe I lost my temper with the high priest like that. Did I do something wrong?" Man, I could just imagine him sinking lower and deeper into despair. And it's at this moment that Paul has a visitor that's going to give him courage. Look at verse 11. This is what verse 11 says. "The following night the Lord stood by him and said, 'Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome.'" The Lord stands beside him, and the Lord says, "Take courage. You're going to get out of here. It's going to be okay. You're going to go to Rome." So how can we take courage when we're in a tough spot? When we're between disappointment and hostility, like a lot of us are right now in our culture? Well, I believe in this verse, verse 11, that we can extract 5 principles, 5 things to see ways that we can take courage in our current situation. And the first one is this: there is another in the battle with us. Let's remember, there is another person in the battle with us that we are all facing right now. And guess what? That person in the battle with us is none other than Jesus Christ, and he has experience at taking courage in the face of fear. If someone is going to tell me they want me to be courageous, I want that person to know exactly what that means. Jesus has that right. Jesus can do that. He knows what it is like to look fear in the face and take courage. He understands what it's like to be between a rock and a hard place, facing hostility and take courage. And his very presence gives us courage. That's why it said the following night the Lord stood next to Paul. His very presence gives us courage. Now I'm a truck driver, That's my first job. Before I was a pastor, I'm a truck driver. And I remember when I was in school, learning to drive an 18-wheeler, it can be a little bit intimidating, a little bit scary, right? You walk up to this huge truck you've seen on the road, and the thing is massive, and you're walking around it, and there's all these parts that you don't know what they are, and you're supposed to remember each and every part. And then you crawl up into the cab, and you see buttons and switches and levers and gauges and pedals and all kinds of stuff, and you're thinking, I'm never gonna figure this out. So you spend the whole first week in school learning what each and every one of those parts is. By the time that first week's over, you know that truck inside and out, what every part does. Well, you spend the whole next week on the road. Now, if I had been expected to get in that truck and get on the road by myself, I would have been a nervous wreck. But that's not the way it works, thankfully. Thankfully, there's a seat right next to you, and an instructor sits right there. And he knows that road well that you're on. He's taught many people to drive, right? And so I got comfortable. I got so comfortable with him sitting there, knowing that anything I might miss, he would see. Knowing that I didn't have to watch everything. He would say, hey, watch out. That there was a couple times that he had to tell me to slow down. Hey, you're going a little fast. Or I'd be a little bit too close to someone. Hey, back up. Or he told me more than once, hey, you might want to start braking a little bit earlier. I think I was scaring the guy, right? But I found comfort in the fact that he was sitting there next to me. It gave me confidence. And so we have another with us in the battle who has experience. And we can take confidence in that. Number two, the second thing we can learn from this passage is that the man who is with us in the battle is also for us. He is for us. He is for our good. He is there for us. Notice when he comes to Paul when he's depressed and downcast. He doesn't come to Paul after some great big victory saying, way to go, Paul. It's when Paul is depressed and downcast. He says, Paul, this is not it. You may have failed, but you're going to get another chance. You're going to get another chance to testify about me. And that's because Jesus understands our weakness intimately. He understands our weakness intimately. Why? Because he became one of us. He knows what it is to be weak, and so he has compassion for us. Jesus is for us. The third thing we can extract from this verse, is this. We need to remember at all times, if you are a child of God, all things are going according to plan. All things are going according to plan. And what does he tell Paul? He tells Paul basically, in so many words, Paul, you are right in the middle of my will. You are right in the middle of my will. How does he do that? Because he says all these trials, all these tribulations, all these struggles you're having right now, they are all for the purpose of bringing you to Rome. That's my goal. All these things are working for your good, believe it or not. The safest place to be, I don't know if you know this, but think about this, it's true. The safest place that we can be is right in the middle of God's will. The safest place that we can be is right in the middle of God's will. Knowing that you are right in the middle of God's will brings tremendous courage. We can face anything if we know that we're doing what he's called us to do. So if you want to take courage in the battle that we're in today, make sure you're right in the middle of God's will. And that's why he tells Paul to take courage. Right? He says, take courage. He doesn't say find courage. He didn't say, Paul, I want you to look inside yourself and just toughen up, find some courage, give yourself a good pep talk. You can do it, Paul. No, he says, take courage. That courage is available because you are doing exactly what I want you to do. There's no better place to be than right in the middle of God's will. Number 4, how can we face a tough situation with courage? We need to remember who we are. We need to remember who we are. I don't know if we have any Andy Griffith fans in here, but I am a big Andy Griffith fan. I know at least all the black and white ones. I don't watch color ones. But all the black and white ones, I know by heart, and I can watch them over and over. But there's this one scene where Andy is sending Opie off to school. He gets down on his knees, he hugs Opie. He goes, now be a good boy and act like somebody. He says, act like somebody. Basically saying, remember who you are. Remember who you want to be, and you act like that. We need to remember who we are. Me and my family just finished watching the live-action Lion King movie. I don't know if you guys have seen it. It's basically a recycled version of the cartoon. They didn't change a whole lot. It's interesting, but it's basically the cartoon in live action. But if you know the story, or if you don't, Simba is the little lion, right? His dad is the big lion, Mufasa, the king. And Mufasa, the king, has a brother named Scar. He's the evil brother who wants to be king, but he can't challenge Mufasa to a fight because he'll lose. So Scar comes up with a plot to kill Mufasa, and he does. He kills Mufasa, and then he blames Simba, the little lion who's next in line to be king, that it's his fault. So Simba runs off and grows up away from the pride. Meanwhile, Scar is the evil king, back with the pride. Well, there's this one scene where Mufasa appears to Simba in the clouds, right? He's dead, but he appears to him in the clouds. And this is what he says. He says, I've never left you and I never will. Remember who you are. I never left you and I never will. Remember who you are. And those very words give Simba the courage that he needs to go back and fight Scar, and he does. But basically what Mufasa is saying to him is, I'm with you. Don't forget that you're the child of a king. Don't forget who you are. You go act like that. And that's what we're to do. We're to remember who we are. We are precious to God. We are loved by God. We have been sought out and sought after by God. We have been fought for by God. God has died for us. We are blood-bought children of the King who have been filled with his Spirit. Don't forget who you are. We need to act like that. We need to act like children of the King. And fifth and finally, what I believe we can extract from this verse, verse 11, is when we need to take courage, we need to remember whose we are. Not only who we are, but whose we are, right? So, Jesus is better than my driving instructor, who gives me confidence that he's sitting there. Jesus is better than Mufasa in the clouds, right? Why is that? Because Jesus created my driving instructor. He created the road that we were driving on. He created the clouds that Mufasa, the powerful and fierce lion, appeared in. He created that lion. And he's promised that he will never leave us or forsake us. God has promised, Jesus has promised that if you are his child here today, all things are working together for your good. All things are working together for your good. And not only that, we can take courage in the fact that there is an empty cross and there is an empty tomb that show us that Jesus has defeated our biggest enemy, death. He has conquered our biggest enemy, death. And so in this scene, Jesus stands beside Paul. He stands beside him and says, take courage. You're going to get out of here and you're going to go to Rome. And guess what? Paul is going to need this supernatural courage because he has two very nasty options before him, Jerusalem and Rome. Paul finds himself between a rock and a hard place. Jesus says to Paul, he says, what you've done here in Jerusalem, I want you to do in Rome. Now, that's not a very comforting thought if you think about it. He's telling Paul, this Jewish Pharisee, I want you to go into the heart of Rome and I want you to share the gospel in the middle of the pagan Roman Empire. Chances are things are not going to go well for Paul. It's not a very comforting thought. So he's going to need to take courage. And the reality of our situation here today is not that different because we still live in a world that is unsettled. We still live in a world that is full of disappointments and hostility towards Christians. And as Christians, we often find ourselves between a rock and a hard place, don't we? So how is the Christian in this heated environment supposed to carry out the Great Commission and speak the truth in love? How in the world are we supposed to do that? How are we supposed to speak the truth in love to people who are hostile to us? Is courage enough? Is it enough that we just take courage? The truth, the reality is that we're going to need not only courage, but we are going to need training. Because as Christians today, we are not only facing the threats of COVID-19 and its economic impact, but the subject of racism has also been brought to the foreground, right? With the killing of George Floyd. Racism and prejudice still exist in our world today. And we must confront racism wherever we see it, and we must partner for justice whenever we can. But this is not easy. This is not easy. Our good intentions are going to be quickly challenged by those of different ambitions and beliefs, right? The opportunity for misunderstanding is huge. The opportunity for offense is even more so. And so if we as Christians are going to come and speak wisely into this issue, it's going to take training. It's going to take courage so that we know how to respond. Not only that issue of racism, but we also have the issue of the abortion crowd who is growing more brazen, who is growing more hostile, who is just growing more vehement. They used to call themselves pro-choice, but they're calling themselves now pro-abortion. They don't care anymore. They are proudly celebrating abortion. The term for abortion, they used to say abortion was to be safe, legal, and rare. Well, they've dropped that motto now because the word rare implies guilt. So they've dropped it. They're now aggressively, proudly pro-death and pro-abortion. We have that issue to face with as well. And we're also confronted with the fact that sexual ethics in our country, in our society right now, have not been dismantled. They've been completely reversed, right? So restraint before marriage is now restraint before marriage, and then monogamy after marriage between a man and a woman for life is not looked at as antiquated and out of fashion. It's looked at as detrimental. People look at it as it actually hurts us. Now you couple that with the militant ambitions of the transgender LGBTQ alliance, and our convictions as Christians, they're going to be challenged. They're going to draw heat. So we've got a lot of things facing us. How in the world are we going to speak the truth in love to all these issues, to all these people? So taking courage practically, what does that mean for us in our church? It means that we're going to act differently. It means that we are going to act differently. How are we going to do that? Well, we're not going to hide from these tough issues. We're not going to hide from these tough issues, but we are also not going to stand here and shout secular talking points at people. We don't want to do that as well. Your church, our church, what we want to do this coming year is our ambition is to help you guys learn how to speak to these issues. That's our goal this year. That's our focus this year. Training and courage. I had an opportunity to sit down with Pastor Eugene recently. He's the lead pastor of our North Campus. I had an opportunity to sit down with him, and he lays out for us some of the ambitions for the church this year and what we can look forward to. So there's an interview here we're going to play right now, my interview with him, and then after that we have a video of all the things that have happened in fellowship over the last year. So here's my interview with Pastor Eugene. So hello, Eugene. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for being here.
Sure.
So we're looking at the year ahead, the church, where the church is headed, what we're looking at, and the theme for this year is taking courage. And so I just wanted to ask you some questions about what that's going to look like for our church. So how did you and the elders come to the theme? How did you decide on the theme for this year, which is taking courage?
Well, Jacob, thank you, and to everybody down south. Good to be seen by you. I hope you're well. We're excited about this coming year. And yeah, the decision to settle on this theme of taking courage seems an obvious choice considering the mayhem over the last few months just with COVID and all the unrest that has been part of that. But the decision was a long time before that. So when we start planning for a year, it's germinating all the time. And then as it grows, we're listening to people, we're talking to people, we're considering the state of affairs locally and globally. Of course, it's all bathed in prayer. And the thing that just showed so clearly was the hostility that we're seeing in our world. Things that were once given were no longer. It's a frightful place to be. And there is a growing anxiety. And I noticed just even dealing online, there were times when I would feel, and I'm not conflict averse, I'd feel an impulsive need to just step back and started looking at that impulsive need going, where's that from? And what's the root of that fear? And how does that relate to faith? And so the more we started considering faith in tumultuous times, considering scripture, there's just this repeated refrain that's take courage, do not be afraid. And so we thought, this is what's needed at this time. And since we made that decision, things became all the more urgent.
So how is this theme of taking courage going to be promoted and embodied by the church?
Yeah, so when we do a vision statement, there's always this balance between kind of institutional apparatus where you think this is a fellowship endeavor where we're going to do church planting, or we're going to send out missionaries, or we're starting a new initiative. And you can almost think of it in terms of institutional activity. It's what the church collective is doing. It doesn't really involve individuals. And then there are those initiatives that recruit every person. So we'd say this is an endeavor, not that the church universal is doing, but we as a church individually, collectively is doing. And this year, the emphasis is more on that side, where we're saying we want our people to take courage. We want them to fulfill this vision and mandate in their sphere of influence. And our task then is not to start new ministries or new global endeavors, but rather to equip individuals.
So you're talking about equipping opportunities for people in the church, and what can we expect in the new year?
Well, we're looking at a number of different hot points or matters of current concern that we're going to have to address. And don't just have to address, but want to address, because it speaks to the heart of God. The topic that is obvious is the issue of race. So since the killing of George Floyd, it touched a nerve in our nation, actually the whole world, and it's had seismic impact. And we can realize and say both that yes, we've seen great progress in race relations, and also say that racism is a real thing and present in our country. How do we address that? How do we show fraternity with our black and brown brothers and sisters, and foster reconciliation in those relationships? And so what we're probably going to do is have a forum, probably in the new year, where we will talk about philosophy, and that's important, right? So when we're saying, how do we say what is biblically and true without falling into talking points with philosophies that are not biblical or true? So we want to be allies to our brothers and sisters without speaking secular talking points. And I'm in discussions with faith leaders both in the white community and the African American community, and looking for opportunities for us to partner. So that's one area, the whole area of race. Another key area is the issue of sexuality. As you know, that the understanding of sexuality hasn't just been deconstructed, it's actually been reversed. And what was once considered noble is now deemed shameful. So the idea of restraint until marriage, and then marriage being monogamy between one man and one wife, one woman for life, that's now deemed as inopportune. And so how do we speak to that? And there again, we intend to have a forum. We're looking at inviting Sam Albury from the UK to come and speak about this. He's a man of great faith. He is well known for his book, Is God Anti-Gay? He deals with same-sex attraction, but he has an orthodox understanding. Very much hope we'll be able to secure him, where we get to talk about what does sexuality look like, relationships, and even understanding singleness, not as curse, but as part of God's purposes and plan. So there'll be that piece too. The issue of life and the sanctity of life is another thing we want to equip people on. The discussion has really changed. There used to be euphemisms like we are pro-choice. Now that is pro-abortion. People used to say, well, we're for safe, legal, and rare, and that's been scuttled too, because the idea that abortion should be rare is now deemed inappropriate. It's not something to be celebrated. And we've seen numerous losses for the pro-life movement in the courts, and it causes some anxiety. Even though more and more people are persuaded by the scientific and biblical fact that life begins at conception, it's a challenge to see us make any ground. And I'm more and more convinced that if we are going to make ground, it's not through legislation. I'd like to see that. Not through courts. I'd certainly like to see that. But it's in hearts and minds. And so how can we partner with organizations like Birth Choice to further that? And my ambition is to participate in the Walk for Life in DC this year. And I'd love to take more people with me. And then lastly, if we're going to take courage, it ought to be for the truth. And so we want to create opportunities where people are familiar with the tenets of the gospel, how to proclaim their faith, and find avenues to speak that. It requires courage. The gospel is an offense to many, but it is a gift to all. And so how do we do that? So those are some of the equipping ambitions that we have.
Sounds great. Okay, so play that out a little bit. What does success look like for our people, and what does courageousness actually look like?
Right. My ambition is not that people would become vocal and hostile. We don't need that. I have a very gentle kind of courage in mind. It's the courage that says, well, I have a different perspective, but it comes from a place of love. So that we're not afraid to participate in national conversations, more importantly, in local conversations, neighborly conversations. And there is so much noise. I love to see our people taking stands, partnering in efforts within the community, and communicating God's truth to those that have been made deaf by the noise.
Now, you yourself are about to take a very courageous plunge this year.
Yeah.
You want to tell our people about it?
Yeah, so one of the things the elders have encouraged me to be is the pastor theologian for fellowship. And because we're blessed by capable leaders like yourself and Van, it gives me the liberty to do that, to be the theologian and not a manager. And part of that is for me to continue my studies. So this year I'm going to start my PhD in theology, and I'll be doing that part-time, so I'll maintain my role and my time here at Fellowship. It's going to be a long and arduous process, but I have enrolled in the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, and I'll be studying joy, Christian joy, particularly in the life and the teaching of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So my hope is that will be a blessing to me and effectively a blessing to the body too.
I'm sure it will. Thank you.
Good being with you.
You too.
God moves in a mysterious way, His wonders to perform. He plants His footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Deep and unfathomable minds of never failing skill, He treasures up His bright designs and works His sovereign will. Ye faithful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds Ye so much dread I beg with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. In blessings on your head. Judge not the Lord by feeble sins, but trust Him for His grace. Behind a frowning providence and scan his works in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain.
Well, that's it. So we're going to play one more song and close out the service. Thank you guys for being here. Looking forward to what the Lord's going to do through our church this next year. I hope you guys are excited as I am as we learn to face these issues, these tough issues that are facing us as a church in a loving and compassionate and a courageous way.